tackling tough topics to help you think reasonably about life's most important issues. This is Thinker Sensitive.
All right, well, hello everyone. Thanks for coming out on a Sunday night with a little rain out there. I'm from Wisconsin, live in Texas. This is actually really refreshing for me to be here and to enjoy trees again. We don't have many of those. So tonight my goal is, so we're going to talk about this topic, does science disprove God? What I really want to do is have a discussion and a dialogue with you guys. And so what I'll do is I'll kind of informally walk through a talk on that question and maybe just say a whole bunch of provocative things that can get us. And so how I describe it to my students is we're just stretching our legs. We're just getting kind of warmed up so that we can actually have a conversation. So that's the goal here. And so to sort of frame the whole discussion, though, I want to just sort of give the context in which we seem to understand science and God in our culture today. And to do that, there's a really helpful essay that C.S. Lewis wrote in 1946, a not well-known essay at all called Talking About Bicycles. And he wrote it for a little periodical in the Great Britain called Resistance Magazine. And basically, he was talking about bicycles, but he was using that to illustrate these 4 stages, actually these 3 that we all go through, but 4 stages that we should go through with respect to pretty much everything. And so he used the bicycle as an illustration, but it really applies to everything. And so this is what he said in there, and it's a really helpful context, I think, for this talk and the topic that we want to talk about today. He says, from a child's perspective, consider the bike. And so when the child comes into the world, the bike it means nothing to him, right? It's just one more gadget in all of the adult gadgets in the world. And so, as Lewis says, he's unenchanted toward that bike. It means nothing to him. But then, as Lewis says, the next comes in the child's life, that moment when, he gets his first bike, and you can I think more of like that moment when the training wheels come off. If you remember that in your own life, or if you have kids, thinking about my own kids, at that moment, Lewis says, suddenly you enter paradise. Life is as it ought to be, and we can now be happy, as he says. And, there's joy in the riding of the bike, there's freedom, and it's life is as it should be. And that, for Lewis, is the enchanted stage. And so the bike has a kind of magic to it. It's a magical moment to ride the bike. But, as you can imagine, because we have all gone to this stage too, pretty soon riding that bike kind of becomes a chore. And it just becomes work. And so we enter what Lewis calls the third stage here, which is, we go back to the third, disenchanted. And we become disenchanted to the bike. It's work, it's drudgery. The language he uses, it's like oars to the galley slave. We don't want to ride that bike anymore. We become disenchanted. And Lewis says that the problem in our culture is that we pretty much stay in this third stage with respect to just about everything. And he says that we need to push beyond that third stage, disenchantment, to this fourth stage, which you saw there is re-enchantment. And what he meant by that was that we need to begin to see the bike, for example, as gift and enjoy it in creaturely response. And he said that's a way to re-enchant our posture towards the bike, but really to re-enchant our posture towards everything. So I give you this sort of, I find this 4 stages thing helpful because right now we find ourselves in culture in that third stage. We live, and actually philosophers, sociologists, people who write and study our culture, they actually use the word disenchanted, that we live in a disenchanted age. And what they mean by that are a number of different things, but that we no longer see the world in its proper light, that we see it as ordinary and mundane and everyday. And I want to suggest to you that that's not the way the world actually is. But here's the question that I want us to begin with. I want to consider the claim of science, and this claim that somehow science disproves God. And I want to begin with the context of embedding it within our cultural sort of mood, which is this disenchanted mood. So with that, let me just throw out one word. And I am a philosopher, and so we just have to throw a few things out here. There's a theory of knowledge today that's pretty much the dominant theory of knowledge, and it's called scientism. I wish I had a blackboard or a whiteboard. I'm way more of a doodler on the board. Scientism. All it means is that it's the view that either the only source for knowledge or the best source of knowledge comes from science. Okay, so that's a theory of knowledge called scientism. And that theory of knowledge, for some people, is thought to entail a metaphysical claim about the nature of reality. So you go from a claim about knowledge, that all of reality is captured by the deliverances of science, to a metaphysical claim that the only thing that exists in reality is the material world, that is, what's captured by science. Okay? So let me just give you an example. So Alex Rosenberg is, he teaches at Duke University, he's the chair of the philosophy department there. 2011, he wrote a book called An Atheist Guide to Reality. And in the first chapter, he has this paragraph. And I want you to just, if you can see that, I want you to hear here how if we're going to be scientistic, then we have to attain our view of reality from what physics tells us. Actually, we'll have to do more than that. We'll have to embrace physics as the whole truth about reality. Why buy the picture of reality that physics paints? Well, it's simple, really. Now, here's the scientism. We trust science as the only way to acquire knowledge. Now, notice the jump. That is why we are so confident about atheism. So here we have a claim about knowledge, that science is the only source of truth, and that generates a metaphysical claim about the nature of reality, that all that exists is what physics tells us, and that's why we're confident that atheism is true. Okay, hopefully you guys kind of see that. The idea is that science explains all of reality. Now, if you read the book, in the prelude, he gives kind of a Gettysburg Address for what science tells us, given atheism, and I'm just going to show it to you because you need to kind of see it. There's a picture of Alex in the book. Okay, so this is from his book here in the opening. He asks a series of questions. Is there a God? Well, no. What is the nature of reality? What physics tells us? What is the purpose of the universe? There is none. What is the meaning to life? Ditto. Why am I here? Just dumb luck. Does prayer work? Of course not. Is there a soul? Is it immortal? Are you kidding? Is there free will? Not a chance. That's attempted a joke there, I think. What happens when we die? Everything pretty much goes on as before, except us. What is the difference between right and wrong, good and bad? There is no moral difference. Why should I be moral? Because it makes you feel better than being immoral. So here's the question. Oh, wait, not this one. Is abortion, euthanasia, suicide, paying taxes, foreign aid, or anything else you don't like forbidden, permissible, or sometimes obligatory? Anything goes. What is love? Here's the question. I bet you wanted to know. What is love? And how do I find it? Oh, it's a strategic interaction problem. And don't look for it. It will find you. Really? Is that what love is? Hey, Ethel? Okay, anyway, that's my wife. Does history have any meaning or purpose? It's full of sound and fury, but it signifies nothing. Does the human past have any lessons for our future? Fewer and fewer, if it ever had any, to begin with. So, there's the preamble. According to Alex Rosenberg, you begin with scientism, and that physics tells us all of reality, and therefore God doesn't exist, and that's the story of atheism. Now, there's much that we could say. I'd love to spend the whole time talking about that, but let me just say two things about this. The first thing is that's just a bad story, right? If atheism is true, we just need to say, like, if God doesn't exist, there's no meaning, there's no purpose, it's just a bad story. I would much rather be Bertrand Russell. He's actually my favorite atheist, and I love teaching Russell because I think he was very clear-eyed. Bertrand Russell was a guy, he lived from 1872 to 1971 or something like that. Like, he just had an incredibly interesting life. But in the 1920s, he wrote a book called Why I Am Not a Christian. He was kind of before the new atheists. You had Bertrand Russell. But in there, he has a chapter called The Free Man's Worship, and in that chapter, he says this, and I think this is very clear-eyed. He says, if we are just the accidental outcome of the collocation of atoms, all we can do is build our lives on the firm foundation of unyielding despair. I think he's right. What Rosenberg does at the end of this book, if you were brave enough to get to the end, he says, you know what? If you don't like this story, then you can take drugs. Literally, that's the end. And he means Prozac and things like that, but I mean, we're in Colorado, so do whatever you want, right? That's kind of depressing. If that's the best we can do, is take drugs, because this is the true story of the world. So I guess I'll move on. Okay. The second thing, though, I just want to say about scientism. So now we're entering back into the philosophy here. It's just, scientism is, number one, overly restrictive, and it's actually self-defeating. So let's talk about that. Well, how's it overly restrictive? Well, I would submit to you, and I think you would agree, if you think about this, there's many things we know that aren't deliverances of science. For example, do you know that 2 + 2 = 4? Yes, I hope we know that, right? But that's not something that's a deliverance of science. We have mathematical knowledge. Do we believe that Abraham Lincoln was our president and so on? Well, yes, but that's not scientific knowledge. That's historical knowledge. Theological knowledge. Do we go to science to debate whether John 3:16 teaches limited atonement or not? I mean, no, we don't go to the scientist. There's other moral knowledge. Torturing babies for fun is wrong. I submit to you that's a fact. That's a piece of knowledge that we have. Does science teach us that? No. So the point is, we know tons of things that aren't from science. So scientism is overly restrictive. Secondly, though, it's self-refuting. And so let's see if you guys, let me go back to the Rosenberg. That's too many slides. Okay. If I say every English sentence is 3 words long, what have I done? I've contradicted myself in the uttering of the sentence, right? Because there was an English sentence that was more than 3 letters or words long. In the same way, if we say that all knowledge comes from science, we are self-refuting ourselves. Does anybody see how? Why is that self-defeating? That's right. It's a deliverance from philosophy. It's a philosophical statement about the nature of knowledge. And so scientism is not a good theory of knowledge. We can talk about what is a good theory, but scientism isn't. Now, lest you think I'm just sort of picking on Alex Rosenberg, who I know, I edited a book where he debated a Christian philosopher, and then we had atheist and Christian scientists, philosophers, and rhetoricians write responses to the debate, and it was a lot of fun. But just so I'm not picking on Alex Rosenberg, let me just give you a few more examples. And this is like representative of a set of, an infinite set that we could probably come up with here. Sean Carroll, a really important cosmologist from the California Institute of Technology. And he wrote in an article in Blackwell's Companion to Science and Christianity, he says, conventional scientific progress will ultimately result, listen to this, in a self-contained understanding of the origin and evolution of the universe without the need to invoke God or any supernatural involvement. So that's an important cosmologist. This is Victor Stenger, late Victor Stenger. He similarly argues that the absence of evidence in God is evidence of the absence of God. And so you have quotes like this. We have no evidence for Bigfoot and the abominable snowman and Loch Ness Monster. So we do not believe that they exist. If we have no evidence or reasons for believing in God, which, by the way, we're going to have to talk about that part here in a minute, well, then we can be pretty sure that God does not exist. Okay, so there's Victor Stenger. How about, you guys know this guy, right? Stephen Hawking, also recently passed away. His last book that he wrote with Leonard Malone now, called The Grand Design, this is what he said. He says, and as a philosopher, I'm hurt here, philosophy is dead. Philosophy has not kept up with modern developments in science, particularly physics. Scientists have become the bearers of the torch of discovery for the quest of knowledge. What's interesting, if you read the book, I don't know if you've read it, but the whole second half of the book is all philosophy, and it's really bad philosophy, because it turns out that the universe creates itself, which is a problem. It's sort of self-refuting. But there's Stephen Hawking, and of course we've got to throw in Richard Dawkins, who wrote The God Delusion, among a number of other books, and actually this quote here is from The God Delusion, but you can kind of hear the sarcasm in this, and the idea is that faith in God is a science stopper, and that if we're going to be properly scientific, we can't appeal to God. In fact, if we did, we would be giving up on science. So you can hear the sarcasm here. If you don't understand how something works, never mind, give it up and say God did it. Please don't go to work on the problem, just give up and appeal to God. Dear scientists, don't work on your mysteries. Bring us your mysteries, for we can use them. Don't squander precious ignorance by researching it away. We need your glorious gaps as a last refuge for God. Okay, so I could go on, but I think you get the point. There's a pretty popular view out there that somehow science disproves God. Okay, and these are leading scientists and popularizers of science that say that. Okay, so what do we say about this? Well, let me just, to get us going here, let me just say a few things. Science actually does have limits, surprisingly. It doesn't explain all of reality. And it can't disprove the existence of God, and so it can't render the godly hypothesis obsolete. Now, here's a couple ways that science has limits. Number one, science makes all these assumptions that we bring to the scientific enterprise. For example, we assume, apart from science, that the world is orderly and uniform so that we can do induction. We assume that our sensory apparatus is accurate to correctly perceive reality, so we can read the data correctly. We assume that language corresponds to the way the world is, and so there's a kind of mind-world fit. None of this comes from science. These are assumptions that we bring to the science. And of course, as we already said, there's lots of things that we do know that don't come from science. So what I think a good way to understand science, let me go back here, is basically this. That science tells us the limits of nature, but it can't tell us that there's nothing beyond nature. Actually, Tim McGrew, a philosopher, puts it that way, and I think that's really helpful. So science tells us the limits of nature, but it really doesn't tell us that there's nothing beyond those limits. So what I want to do now is I want to ask the question, well, what does science actually show? And I think if we properly understand how science works, I want to make the opposite claim. So the claim is that science disproves God. I want to show you now how I think that the more reasonable position is that science actually supports belief in God. And to do that, we just have to make a few distinctions. So when I went to did my master's, I studied under J.P. Moreland, and one of the first things he said was he said, in order to be good thinkers, we need to learn to make distinctions. And in order to be good teachers, we need to learn to teach distinctions. So let's just make one distinction here so we can understand how science works. So first of all, how does science support belief in God? Let me give you a sentence, and so just kind of follow this here. So science provides evidence in support of a philosophical premise, or in support of a premise, in a philosophical argument that has a theological conclusion, okay? Let me just say that again, because that's actually really important to kind of follow this. So science provides evidence in support of a premise in a philosophical argument with a theological conclusion, okay? So I'm going to show you that in a minute. But that's kind of how I envision how science supports God. It's not like, science gives us a proof either way. Science is evidence, and you plug it into arguments, and that's where it does its work, okay? And I'm going to give you an example of that here in a minute. So how do we generate an argument that utilizes science? It's kind of simple, actually. You just take any empirical phenomena in the world and that you want, and take it and plug it into a premise, and see if you can generate a philosophical or theological conclusion in your argument. Okay, so for example, classic arguments for God, the cosmological argument. It takes the universe itself, plugs it into a premise with a theological conclusion. Or the teleological argument, like the fine-tuning argument, takes empirical premises about the fine-tuning of the world for life, plugs it into a premise with a theological conclusion. So here's an example. Let's just take the universe. And actually, here's the argument. This is maybe some of you have heard this. This is a fairly, out there argument, but it's simple, and that's why I like it, because I think it demonstrates kind of this idea of how science fits into arguments. So this is called the Kalam cosmological argument. I just want to walk through it informally with you and just kind of show you how what I just said works, and then we'll have a discussion about it. So this is the argument. It's very simple, 2 premises and a conclusion. Premise 1, whatever begins to exist has a cause. Premise 2, the universe began to exist. That's where the science is going to come in. And then the conclusion, therefore, the universe has a cause. Now, the conclusion there is the conclusion with the theological implications. So we'll kind of walk through and show you that first. But let me just show you why I think each of those premises are more reasonable than their denial. In other words, why I think each of those premises are true. What can we say for premise 1? So remember, premise 1, whatever begins to exist has a cause. And again, I'm just going to repeat some things that are out there. William Lane Craig, these are reasons from his work if you want to check it out. 3 reasons why premise 1 is true. First of all, something cannot come from nothing. This is actually, there's a phrase from the medieval philosophers called ex nihil nihil fit. Out of nothing, nothing comes. Ex nihil nihil fit. And it was thought by the medievals to be a metaphysical principle. In other words, a necessary truth. If there is nothing, nothing comes out of nothing, right? That seems like a pretty intuitive truth, something that is as secure as something like 2 + 2 = 4. Now, what's interesting, there is at least one writer, scientist, that's arguing against this premise, Lawrence Krauss, who teaches astronomy at the University of Arizona. He wrote a book called The Universe Out of Nothing. But if you read his book, what's very interesting about the nothing there is the nothing turns out to be something, right? It's actually the quantum vacuum, which is composed of lots of things, force fields that actually negate each other, but it's something. And so his book, even though it's an attempt to try to get out of this premise, it actually isn't a counterexample to it. So ex nihilo nihil fit, out of nothing, nothing comes. That's that first reason. Secondly, they'll say that some things do come out of nothing. Well, then why universes? I mean, why not a new MacBook Pro every year? Or, that would be kind of cool if that came into existence out of nothing, because I like MacBook Pros. Why not Twinkies? I like Twinkies. Why is it just universes that come into being out of nothing? It just seems arbitrary, right? A little arbitrary. Third reason up there, and this is, I guess, maybe pretty plausible too, common experience and scientific evidence confirm the truth of premise one every day. It's the foundation of science, right? There's an effect, and whenever we have an effect, we go look for a cause. Things don't just pop into the universe as surds. It's actually a technical term, S-U-R-D, that these contingent surds that just pop in out of nothing. That's just not how it happens. That's why we have science. So premise one is secure. In fact, what's interesting is all the debate has been in premise two, but because of all the evidence from science, atheists are circling back and trying to find weaknesses in premise one. But we have to go to premise two. So because I submit to you, premise one is pretty solid. Okay, premise two. Premise two, remember, is the claim the universe began. So premise one, whatever begins to exist has a cause. Premise two, the universe began to exist. Now, this is where I want to kind of show you how science can fit into that. So there's two lines of evidence that come from science that show that the universe began to exist. So again, we want science is used as evidence in support of a premise and a philosophical argument with a theological conclusion. So what's the evidence from science? The first piece of evidence here is what's called the expansion of the universe. And that implies that the universe began a finite time ago if you contract back in time. So, for example, before 1917, actually, before 1905, it started to crumble a little there with Einstein. But before 1905, 1917, it was widely thought that the universe was eternal, that it was static. And then Einstein starts to mess with that, with his special theory of relativity in 1905, and then specifically the general theory of relativity in 1917. And he realizes in his field equations that something's not right. And it looks like, according to these equations, the universe is expanding. And so Einstein does one of his biggest regrets in his life. He fudges the cosmological constant number in his field equations to get rid of the expansion of the universe. He later goes on and says he regrets that as one of his biggest mistakes. But then, so that's 1917. 1929, though, you have this guy, Edwin Hubble. Edwin Hubble is sitting in Mount Wilson. Has anybody been to Mount Wilson in Los Angeles? You can go there today. It's an observatory. And so he's sitting there in his observatory in Los Angeles, 1929, looking up at the night sky. And what he notices is called he notices something called redshift. And what redshift is think about it this way: if this clicker here was a light source, and so I'm holding it out here. If the light source is, and of course light travels to us in waves, and so if the light source is moving toward me, the wave would contract, it would shrink. And so what happens is the light source would move to the blue end of the spectrum, right? But if the light source is moving away from you, the waves would become longer. And it's what that's called is redshift. It would move to the red end of the light spectrum. And so what you have here is 1929 Edwin Hubble looking up in the night sky, and he notices all over the sky redshift. And this was the first sort of scientific confirmation of things that were already predicted theoretically of the expansion of the universe, that the universe is expanding, and not just expanding, but expanding isotropically in all directions away from us, okay? So that's 1929. 1940, so the standard model of the Big Bang sort of became by the 1940s the standard model of the origin of the universe. And the idea of the Big Bang is that 13.72 billion years ago, and we can talk about all that, but here's the standard model, 13.72 billion years ago, all matter, energy, time, and space came into existence out of a singularity that is this mathematical point of infinite density equivalent to nothing. So out of nothing, all matter, time, energy, and space came into being. That's the standard model. By about the 1950s, that became the dominant model. 1945, a guy named Gamow is saying, okay, if the standard Big Bang is true, we would expect to see what we would expect to see the effects of this gigantic explosion, the Big Bang. We'd see effects of this all over the universe, called microwave background radiation. So in 1946, he predicts it. 1965, a couple guys from Bell Telephone Laboratory are looking up in the night sky with their instruments, and they discover it. And they discover it exactly, very close to the degree that Gamow predicted 20 years later. Since then, it's been confirmed over and over again. You have this microwave background radiation that's like the heat signature of the origin event of the universe. Think of it like if you have a stove that's, like we have an electric stove in our house, the stovetop where you turn it on and then it boils the water, and then you turn it off and it goes red, and then the red goes away, and then you can still hold your hand over it and it's hot. Well, and so what's happening is it's going into the microwave range there. And that's what's happening to the universe. You see that cooling, but you see the effect of it everywhere. So there's scientific evidence that supports the premise that the universe began a finite time ago. Okay, let's see here. There's another piece of scientific evidence that actually comes from the second law of thermodynamics. And so if you guys are going, go back to high school. My daughter's in physics right now, so she gets to learn about the second law of thermodynamics, which is this idea that, simply put, in a closed system, you go from usable energy to non-usable energy, or so you go from low entropy to equilibrium or high entropy. And what's interesting, if the universe was eternal, we would expect that all of the usable energy would have already run down, right? Because that's the second law of thermodynamics. Think of it this way. If we were all sitting here and a red kickball came through those doors and was bouncing in the back there, and maybe it took a turn and bounced all the way up here, would you infer that kickball has just sort of been bouncing for eternity and went through Texas and it made its way here and it's just, would we infer that? No. You'd probably look outside and see where that kid is that kicked the ball, right? Because it hasn't yet reached equilibrium. It's eventually going to come to rest. That's the second law of thermodynamics. Or suppose that I don't, but if I had a cup of coffee up here and you walked in this room and it was hot, what would you infer about how long that cup of coffee has been here? You'd infer that it was recently put there, right? Because it has not yet reached equilibrium. It has not taken on the temperature of the room. That's the second law of thermodynamics. Think of the universe like a large cup of coffee. If it was eternal, it would have run down all of its usable energy. The fact that it hasn't run down all that usable energy shows you that that it's not eternal, that it's existed for a finite time. That's scientific evidence from the second law of thermodynamics to support that premise. So there's more that could be said, but I want to kind of talk it through and then get to discussing. So I submit to you that there we have good scientific evidence that give us good reason to think that premise is true. Okay. So if that premise is true, the universe began to exist, and that first premise was true, everything that begins to exist has a cause, that leads to the conclusion inescapably, because we have a deductive argument here. So if the first two premises are true, the conclusion follows inescapably. And the conclusion again, The conclusion again is that there is a cause to the universe. Now here's where it becomes theological. What is the nature of this cause of the universe? Well, a few things that you can say as you kind of examine the case. Well, this cause must be personal. And here's why. I'll just sort of talk it through. Basically, there's two types of causes, and we philosophers debate all this all the time, but there's event causation, and there's what's called agent causation. So you guys are agents, right? So you're first causes. Like when I raise my hand, I'm a first cause of my raising of my hand. That's an agent causal act. But there's also event causation. Think of one domino knocking over another domino. That's one prior event that causes another event. Two kinds of causes. Event causation is also called state-to-state causation. But here's the interesting thing. Given the singularity, there's no prior state to the universe. So it can't be state-to-state causation. It can't be event causation. The only other kind of causation that it could be that is the cause that brought the universe into being is agent causation. And agents go with persons. So the cause of the universe is personal. That's really significant, actually. It's not just personal, it's uncaused. Because if the cause of the universe had a cause, well then there must be something else, because everything that begins to exist has a cause. And so it must be uncaused and eternal or necessary. It must be immaterial, because remember, in the Big Bang, all matter, time, energy, and space came into being. So whatever this personal, uncaused, necessary cause of the universe is, it must be immaterial, eternal, because if it began, it would need a cause. Enormously powerful. I mean, this argument doesn't give you like omnipotence or something, but I mean, if you look at the scope and of the universe, the scale of the universe, whatever this cause is that brought the universe into being must be immensely powerful. Incredibly intelligent. Of course, we don't get to omniscience here, but if you consider that, especially if you would consider the complexity of the universe, whatever the cause is incredibly intelligent. So if you look at this list, this isn't the God of the Bible yet, right? It's not the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Jesus, but it's consistent with the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Jesus, right? It's consistent with the God of the Bible, and that's kind of how these arguments function is, and actually, when I look at this argument, I kind of put it in a cumulative case, and so the result of the cosmological argument is we find a universe that's ontologically haunted by some cause that transcends the universe. That's kind of interesting, if that's true, right? But we have an argument that says it is true. All right, let me just wrap up, and then we'll, and then one. Let's wrap this up with Tolkien. How do we get to Tolkien from this? But that's J.R. Tolkien. And let's go back to this essay on bicycles and disenchantment and things like that. Now, there's this wonderful essay by J.R. Tolkien called On Fairy Stories. It's a brilliant essay where he's actually talking about, his theology of, and philosophy of fantasy. But in this essay, he says three things that I think are really helpful as we think about the different stories that compete for our allegiance in the world. And materialism, scientism, atheism is a story. Christianity, of course, is a story. And there's many other stories that compete for your allegiance. But there's three things that he says in that essay that I find really helpful, and I'm just going to summarize them for you. First, he makes a distinction there between what he calls primary belief and secondary belief. Primary belief is the beliefs we hold in the primary world of our experience, like the beliefs that we actually hold. But we enter into a secondary fictional world. He says we take on the beliefs within that world. So, and you guys have all experienced this, right? So when you watch a movie, you experience joy when the couple finally come together, or you experience relief when the hero escapes from the hands of defeat. And we all experience this, right? The secondary belief where we enter into the story. So that's the first thing that Tolkien says in this essay. The second thing, though, is he says there's a kind of story that we all long for as humans. And it's something that we long for in movies and in books, and it's a kind of story that has five things. We long for what he calls a magical, even a supernatural world. Think about Middle-earth and all his stories. We long for a world where love is eternal, where death is cheated, where victory is snatched out of the hands of defeat, and there's a happy ending. He says this is the story that we all long for, and of course he's talking about fairy stories, but I think it broadens to any story that we like. It has these things. And the third thing he does, though, is he says, why do we long for that kind of story? Because he says at the fact value at the level of our lives, we know that often evil triumphs, and that our lives are temporally bound, and that there's not always a happy ending. And then, of course, the intelligentsia tell us that there is no magical or supernatural world, right? I just showed you tons of examples in the beginning. He says, why do we long for that kind of world when we're told, and we know at the level of our lives that these things aren't true? And he says this, and this is where I think it's really interesting. He answers his own question in this way. He says that fairy stories point to an underlying reality that he thinks is actually more true than the primary world of our experience. And he says that's why we love those kinds of stories. I think it's any good story. Think of the classic stories that we're drawn to. I think it has those five elements. And what he says is this underlying story, though, that we all long for, this is the payoff. He says that underlying story is the gospel story. It's the Christian story. That's actually what we all long for. And he says you get everything in the Christian story. You get victory snatched out of the hands of defeat. You get love is eternal. Death is cheated. The world is supernatural. And then you have a happy ending. He says you get everything you long in the gospel story. But then he asks this question. He says, okay, well, is the gospel story one more story that points to some deeper reality? And he says, no, here's the difference. In the gospel story, you get the point of story itself. And the point of story itself is Jesus. Jesus is the point of story. And then he talks about how because of the incarnation and the resurrection, these are theological terms, but because God became man and entered this physical world, and then he died and actually rose from the dead, he says because of that, the Christian story is not just one more good story that when you walk out of the movie theater or put the book down, you enter real life, but actually this story has the ring of truth because God entered into history. And so what happens here is you have a story that breaks into our world and introduces a joy that's more complete than any actual fairy story. And I guess it points us or pushes us to two questions in this whole debate about science and God. I think there's kind of a meta issue going on here. And the two questions I would want to leave you with, and then let's have a dialogue, are this, really. Think about all the competing stories out there. Scientism, we looked at the story of atheism, the Christian story, other stories, and ask this question: which of these stories understands you? Which of these stories is alive? And a story that we can actually find meaning and purpose and an identity and hope and joy in the midst of sorrow. Next question: is there a story that's alive? And I want to submit to you that the answer is yes. That the gospel story is both alive and it understands us, and God invites us to locate our lives in that story. And he invites us into a relationship with the point of story itself, which is Jesus. So does science disprove God? No, I don't think so at all. I think that properly understood, science confirms what the Christian story has told us all along, that we inhabit an enchanted world that is not nature, but it's actually creation. And as creation, it's actually gift. And that's the proper way to re-enchant the world, is to see it in its proper light and then enjoy it in creaturely response as we enjoy it as gift. That's it.
For more thinker-sensitive content, visit thinkersensitive.com.